The winter wind cut through the gaps in the wooden cabin like a knife, carrying with it the promise of another hungry night. 8-year-old Mary Sullivan pressed her face against the frost-covered window, watching the snow pile higher against their door. Her breath created small circles of fog on the glass as she searched the horizon for any sign of her father returning from town. Inside the one-room cabin, the silence was broken only by the occasional crackle from the dying fire and her baby brother's weak cries. Her mother, Sarah, sat in the corner rocking chair, her face gaunt and eyes hollow from weeks of worry. The family had moved to this remote part of Northern California 3 months ago, following promises of gold and fertile land. Instead, they found harsh winters, failed crops, and a father who spent more time with a bottle than with his family. Mary's stomach cramped with hunger. They had finished the last of their dried beans 2 days ago, and her father had taken what little money they had to buy whiskey instead of food. She had heard her parents arguing the night before, her mother pleading with him to think of the children, her father shouting that he needed the drink to forget their troubles. The child pressed her small hands against her empty belly and whispered a prayer she had learned from her grandmother back in Ireland. She remembered the stories of the potato famine, how families had starved while others prospered. She never imagined she would face such hunger in America, the land of plenty they had dreamed about during their ocean crossing. As darkness began to fall, Mary heard footsteps crunching through the snow outside. Her heart leaped with hope, thinking her father had returned with food. But when she peered through the window, she saw a different figure approaching their cabin. The person moved with quiet confidence through the snow, carrying what appeared to be a bundle over their shoulder. The stranger was tall and lean, dressed in clothes that seemed better suited for the harsh weather than her family's thin garments. As the figure drew closer, Mary could see it was a Native American man, his long black hair tied back and his face weathered by years of outdoor life. She had heard stories about the local tribes, some frightening tales from the townspeople, but also whispers of their knowledge of the land and survival skills. Her mother noticed her watching and quickly moved to the window, pulling Mary away. Sarah's face filled with worry as she saw the approaching stranger. The newspapers had been full of stories about conflicts between settlers and the Modoc tribe, and fear had spread through the scattered homesteads like wildfire. But as they watched, the man stopped a respectful distance from their cabin and called out in clear English, his voice carrying across the snow-covered clearing. He spoke of seeing their smoke and noticing their struggle, asking if they needed help. There was something in his tone that didn't match the fearsome stories Mary had heard. Her mother hesitated, torn between fear and desperation. The baby's cries grew weaker, and Mary felt another sharp pang of hunger. Through the window she could see the bundle the man carried, and her child's intuition told her it might contain food. The stranger waited patiently in the snow, not moving closer or making any threatening gestures. His presence seemed to fill the quiet evening with possibility, as if he might be the answer to Mary's whispered prayers. The wind picked up again, howling around the cabin and reminding them all of the harsh reality of their situation. Mary tugged at her mother's worn dress and looked up at her with pleading eyes. Sometimes, she thought, help came from the most unexpected places, just like in the stories her grandmother used to tell. Perhaps this man, despite being different from them, might understand what it meant to be hungry and alone in an unforgiving wilderness. As her mother finally moved toward the door, Mary felt a flutter of hope in her chest. The stranger's quiet patience and respectful distance spoke of honor and kindness, qualities that seemed rare in their current world of struggle and survival. Joseph Running Bear had been tracking deer through the frozen wilderness for 2 days when he first spotted the smoke rising from the Sullivan cabin. As a member of the Modoc tribe, he knew these mountains and valleys like the lines on his weathered hands. He had lived through the recent conflicts with the white settlers, had seen his people forced from their ancestral lands, and had learned to be cautious around the newcomers who continued to arrive despite the harsh conditions. But something about the thin, struggling smoke from the distant cabin troubled him. It was the kind of smoke that spoke of desperation, of people burning furniture or anything they could find to stay warm. Joseph had seen such signs before, during the worst winters when even his own people had faced starvation. He adjusted the fresh deer meat wrapped in hide across his shoulders and continued his journey home to his family. His wife, Mourning Dove, was expecting their 3rd child, and his elderly mother needed the nutrition that only fresh meat could provide. The successful hunt had taken him far from his village, but the large buck he had brought down would feed his family for weeks. As he drew closer to the cabin, Joseph could hear the faint crying of a baby carried on the wind. The sound stopped him in his tracks, reminding him of his own children and the universal language of hunger and distress. Despite the tensions between his people and the white settlers, despite the fear and mistrust that existed on both sides, the cry of a hungry child was something that transcended all boundaries. Joseph had been raised by his grandfather, a wise man who taught him that strength was not just in hunting and fighting, but in showing mercy and compassion when others were in need. His grandfather had shared stories of times when different tribes helped each other through harsh winters, understanding that survival sometimes required cooperation rather than competition. He studied the cabin more carefully, noting the poorly chinked walls that would offer little protection against the bitter cold, the small garden plot that showed signs of failed crops, and the general air of poverty that surrounded the homestead. These people were clearly not the wealthy land grabbers he had heard about in the territorial capital, but rather desperate families seeking a better life and finding only hardship. The warrior remembered his own childhood, during a particularly harsh winter when a neighboring tribe had shared their stored salmon with Joseph's people. That act of kindness had saved many lives, including his own mother's. The memory of that generosity had shaped his understanding of what it meant to be truly strong and honorable. As he approached the cabin, Joseph moved slowly and deliberately, keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. He had learned enough English from traders and government officials to communicate, though he preferred the flowing sounds of his native tongue. The fear he sensed from inside the cabin was familiar, a response he had grown accustomed to from white settlers who had heard exaggerated stories about his people. He stopped at what he judged to be a respectful distance and called out to announce his presence. Joseph explained that he had noticed their situation and wondered if they might need assistance. He spoke carefully, choosing words that would convey his peaceful intentions while respecting their obvious wariness. Through the window, he could see the shadow of a woman and child watching him. The woman's hesitation was understandable, given the stories that circulated about Indians attacking isolated homesteads. Joseph knew that many of his own people harbored similar fears about white settlers, having experienced violence and broken promises from those in power. But standing in the snow outside this struggling family's cabin, Joseph saw beyond the color of their skin or the differences in their customs. He saw a mother trying to protect her children, just as his own wife protected theirs. He saw the desperation that hunger and cold could bring to any family, regardless of their background. The deer meat on his shoulders felt heavier as he waited for their response. He thought of his grandfather's teachings about the circle of life and how generosity returned to those who gave freely. Perhaps this moment was a test of his character, an opportunity to show that kindness could exist even in times of conflict and mistrust. Joseph remained motionless in the snow, demonstrating the patience that had served him well as both a hunter and a father. He understood that trust had to be earned, especially in circumstances like these, and he was willing to wait as long as necessary for them to decide whether to accept his offer of help. Sarah Sullivan's hands trembled as she reached for the door handle, her mind racing between fear and desperate hope. The stranger's voice had been gentle, but she had heard too many stories from other settlers about trusting the wrong people in this wild territory. Yet her baby's cries were growing weaker by the hour, and Mary's hollow cheeks reminded her daily of their dire situation. She pressed her ear against the rough wooden door, listening to the man's patient breathing in the cold air outside. He hadn't tried to force his way in or make demands. Instead, he waited with a stillness that seemed almost respectful. This behavior contradicted everything the townspeople had told her about the local tribes, their warnings about savage attacks and stolen children. Her husband Patrick had been gone for 3 days now, supposedly seeking work in the mining camp 20 miles away. But Sarah knew better. She had smelled the whiskey on his breath before he left, had seen the wild look in his eyes that came when the drink took hold of him completely. He had taken their last silver dollar, promising to return with food and supplies. But she feared he would spend it all on alcohol and gambling. The baby stirred in her arms, his tiny face pale and his lips slightly blue from the cold. She had stopped producing enough milk to feed him properly, her own malnourished body unable to sustain both of them. Mary pressed against her side, seeking warmth and comfort, her small body shivering despite the layers of threadbare clothing. Through the window, Sarah could see the mysterious figure still standing in the same spot, his breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. The bundle he carried looked substantial, and she found herself imagining what might be inside. Food, perhaps, or warm blankets that could help them survive another night. She thought about her mother back in Boston, who had begged them not to make this journey west. Her mother had warned that California was no place for a family with young children, that the promises of easy gold and fertile land were often lies told to desperate people. Sarah had been so confident then, so sure that Patrick's dreams would become their reality. Now, standing in a cabin that leaked cold air through every crack, holding a hungry baby while her daughter looked up at her with trust-filled eyes, Sarah realized how foolish they had been. Pride and stubbornness had brought them to this remote place. But pride wouldn't feed her children or keep them warm through the winter. The man outside called out again, his words carrying a note of genuine concern. He mentioned seeing children in the window and understanding the difficulties of winter survival. His English was careful but clear, and there was something in his tone that reminded Sarah of her own father's voice when he comforted frightened animals on their farm. Mary tugged at her mother's dress and whispered that the man seemed kind, that maybe God had sent him to help them. The child's simple faith cut through Sarah's complex fears and prejudices. Perhaps desperation had a way of stripping away the barriers that people built between themselves and others. Sarah made her decision with the same impulsive courage that had brought them west in the first place. She unlocked the door and opened it just a few inches, enough to speak but ready to slam it shut if necessary. The cold air rushed in immediately, but so did something else. A sense of possibility that had been absent from their cabin for weeks. The Native American man stood exactly where he had been, making no move to approach. His face was kind but serious, marked by lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 40 years, with graying temples and calloused hands that suggested a lifetime of hard work. When their eyes met, Sarah saw something that surprised her completely. She saw a father's understanding, the look of someone who knew what it meant to worry about children's welfare. In that moment, the stories and fears that had shaped her opinion of his people seemed less important than the immediate reality of her family's need. The man gestured toward his bundle and spoke slowly, explaining that he had been hunting and had more meat than his own family could use. He offered to share it with them, asking nothing in return except the knowledge that children would not go hungry. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of genuine compassion. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes as she realized that help had come from the most unexpected source. This man, who according to local gossip should be their enemy, was offering them the very thing they needed most. Sometimes, she thought, angels came in forms that challenged everything you thought you knew about the world. Joseph Running Bear watched as the cabin door slowly opened wider, revealing a young woman with exhausted eyes and a baby cradled in her arms. Behind her, he could see a small girl peering around her mother's skirts, her thin face filled with curiosity rather than fear. The sight of the children's obvious hunger stirred something deep in his chest, a protective instinct that recognized no boundaries of race or culture. He carefully unwrapped a portion of his bundle, revealing the fresh venison within. The meat was still good, properly prepared and wrapped to preserve it during his journey home. Joseph had learned the old ways of preserving food from his grandmother, knowledge that had kept his family alive through many harsh winters in the mountains. Sarah stepped outside despite the bitter cold, her maternal instincts overriding her fear as she saw the quality of the meat he offered. It was more food than her family had seen in weeks, enough to sustain them for days if prepared properly. The generosity of the gesture overwhelmed her, bringing tears to her eyes as she realized this stranger was offering to give up his own family's sustenance for theirs. Joseph spoke quietly about his own children waiting at home, how he understood the sound of hungry babies and the worry that kept parents awake at night. He explained that the deer had been large and his family would have enough, even after sharing this portion. His words carried the truth that only another parent could recognize, the universal language of love and concern for children's welfare. Mary stepped out from behind her mother, her natural childhood curiosity overcoming the warnings she had heard about Indians. She looked up at Joseph with wide blue eyes and asked if he was really going to give them food. Her innocent directness brought a smile to the warrior's weathered face. reminding him of his own daughter's fearless questions about the world around her. The child's simple trust seemed to break down the last barriers between the two adults. Sarah found herself inviting Joseph to step closer to the cabin's shelter, away from the biting wind that was turning their breath to ice. As he approached, she noticed the careful way he moved, always keeping his hands visible and his posture non-threatening. Joseph accepted her invitation but remained standing, understanding that entering their home uninvited would be inappropriate. Instead, he showed Sarah how to properly prepare the venison, sharing knowledge about which cuts would provide the most nutrition for the children, and how to make a rich broth from the bones that would help restore their strength. As they talked, Sarah learned that Joseph lived with his own extended family in a village about 15 miles away. He spoke of his pregnant wife and elderly mother, of the responsibilities that weighed on him as a provider and protector. She began to understand that beneath the cultural differences, they shared the same fundamental concerns about family survival and the welfare of their loved ones. The baby in Sarah's arms had stopped crying, perhaps sensing the change in his mother's mood or the promise of nourishment to come. Mary moved closer to Joseph, fascinated by his knowledge of the wilderness and his gentle manner with children. She asked him about the animals in the forest and whether he knew stories about them, her hunger temporarily forgotten in the excitement of meeting someone new. Joseph found himself charmed by the child's curiosity and began telling her about the deer he had tracked, describing how he had followed its signs through the snow for 2 days before making the kill. He spoke of respecting the animal's sacrifice and using every part to honor its life, concepts that resonated with Sarah's own understanding of not wasting precious resources. As the conversation continued, both adults began to relax in each other's presence. Joseph's patient demeanor and obvious care for children gradually erased Sarah's fears, while his respectful behavior challenged every negative story she had heard about his people. She found herself thinking about her own prejudices and how desperation had forced her to see beyond them. The warrior carefully cut away the portion of venison he intended to give them, wrapping it properly to protect it from the cold. As he prepared to leave the remaining meat with them, Mary suddenly spoke up, her small voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. She asked if his own children would have enough to eat, her innocent concern for his family's welfare touching both adults deeply. Joseph assured her that his family would be fine, that sharing was part of his people's way of life, especially when children were hungry. He explained that kindness given freely always found its way back to the giver, a lesson his grandfather had taught him long ago. His words carried the wisdom of generations, an understanding of life's interconnectedness that transcended cultural boundaries. Sarah realized she was witnessing something remarkable, a demonstration of humanity that cut through all the fear and mistrust that divided their communities. This man was willing to sacrifice his own family's comfort to help strangers, asking nothing in return except the knowledge that children would not suffer. As Joseph prepared to hand over the wrapped venison, Mary stepped forward and looked up at him with the devastating honesty that only children possess. Her small voice trembled as she spoke words that would echo in both adults' minds for years to come. "Papa will starve me without whiskey," she whispered, her blue eyes filled with a wisdom no 8-year-old should have to carry. The simple statement hung in the cold air like a confession, revealing the truth that Sarah had been too ashamed to admit even to herself. Mary's words stripped away all pretense and exposed the real reason for their desperate situation. It wasn't just bad luck or harsh weather that had brought them to the edge of starvation. It was Patrick's growing dependence on alcohol and his willingness to prioritize his addiction over his children's basic needs. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment and pain, her worst fears laid bare by her daughter's innocent honesty. She wanted to correct Mary, to explain that Papa was just struggling with difficult times, but the words died in her throat, because they both knew the child was speaking the truth. Patrick had indeed taken their last money for whiskey instead of food, leaving his family to face hunger while he sought escape in a bottle. Joseph's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in his dark eyes, a deeper understanding of the complexity of their situation. He had encountered white settlers before who struggled with the demon of alcohol, had seen how it could destroy families and communities just as effectively as war or disease. His own people had their own stories of how the white man's liquor had brought devastation to tribal villages. The warrior knelt down to Mary's level, bringing himself eye to eye with the brave little girl who had spoken such difficult truths. He told her gently that sometimes adults made poor choices, but that didn't mean children should suffer for those mistakes. His words carried the weight of someone who had seen both the best and worst of human nature, who understood that survival sometimes required accepting help from unexpected sources. Mary nodded solemnly, her small hand reaching out to touch the wrapped meat as if to confirm it was real. She asked Joseph if he thought her papa might get better, if there was a way to help grown-ups who couldn't stop drinking the bad water that made them mean and forgetful. Her question revealed the depth of her understanding about their family's problems and her desperate hope that somehow things could change. Joseph spoke carefully about addiction and healing, explaining that some sicknesses affected the spirit rather than the body, and that healing such wounds required great strength and the support of others who cared. He told Mary that her father's problems were not her fault, that children were never responsible for their parents' choices, good or bad. Sarah listened to this conversation with growing amazement, struck by how this Native American stranger seemed to understand their family's struggles better than many of their own neighbors. While other settlers had whispered behind their backs about Patrick's drinking, Joseph offered compassion without judgment, recognizing the disease rather than simply condemning the man. The baby in Sarah's arms had fallen asleep, exhausted by hunger and cold, his tiny face peaceful for the first time in days. Looking down at her son, Sarah felt the full weight of her responsibility as a mother, and the crushing realization that she might not be able to protect her children from the consequences of their father's addiction. Joseph stood slowly, his joints stiff from kneeling in the snow, and placed the wrapped venison in Sarah's free arm. He explained how to prepare it to get the maximum nutrition for the children, sharing knowledge about making bone broth that would help restore their strength gradually, rather than overwhelming their weakened systems with too much rich food at once. Mary tugged at Joseph's coat and asked if he would come back to check on them, her fear of abandonment obvious in her voice. The child had learned not to trust promises from adults, having heard too many broken commitments from her father, but something about Joseph's quiet strength made her want to believe that some people kept their word. The warrior promised to return in a few days with more food if needed, though he warned that his own family's needs would have to come first. He explained to Mary that good people took care of their own families before helping others, but that didn't mean they stopped caring about their neighbors' welfare. His honesty about his limitations actually increased Sarah's trust in his character. As Joseph prepared to leave, Mary made one final request that surprised both adults. She asked if she could give him something in return for his kindness, explaining that her grandmother had taught her it was important to give back when someone helped you. From her pocket, she pulled out a small wooden cross that her grandmother had carved for her before they left Ireland, the only precious thing she still possessed. The offering was so innocent and heartfelt that Joseph felt his throat tighten with emotion. He accepted the tiny cross with the same reverence he would show to any sacred object, understanding that the child was giving him something irreplaceable. In that moment, the exchange became more than just food for survival. It became a bridge between two worlds, built on the foundation of a child's pure generosity. Joseph carefully tucked Mary's small wooden cross into the inner pocket of his coat, close to his heart, where he kept his own sacred items. The weight of the gift was far greater than its physical presence, carrying with it the trust and gratitude of a child who had been taught to give even when she had almost nothing left to offer. As he prepared to leave, he promised both Mary and Sarah that he would treasure the cross and remember their courage in facing such difficult circumstances. The journey back to his village gave Joseph time to reflect on the encounter and what it meant for both families. He thought about the cycles of generosity that his grandfather had described, how acts of kindness moved through communities like ripples on a pond, often returning to the giver in unexpected ways. The wooden cross seemed to pulse against his chest, reminding him that sometimes the greatest gifts came from the smallest hands. When Joseph arrived home, his wife Mourning Dove immediately noticed the reduced size of his hunting bundle. Her pregnancy had made her more sensitive to their family's needs, and she worried about having enough food stored for the coming winter months. But as Joseph told her about the starving white family and the brave little girl who had given him her grandmother's cross, Mourning Dove's concerns transformed into understanding and support. Their own children, 7-year-old Dancing Waters and 5-year-old Little Wolf, listened wide-eyed as their father described Mary's courage and her mother's desperate situation. The story sparked conversations about kindness across cultural boundaries and the importance of helping others, even when those others might be seen as different or strange by their community. Joseph's elderly mother, Singing Crow, examined the wooden cross with the reverence due to any object of faith. Though it represented beliefs different from her own, she recognized the love and craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. She spoke about the universal nature of prayer and protection, how all people sought the same divine care for their children, regardless of the specific forms their faith might take. Meanwhile, back at the Sullivan cabin, Sarah worked through the night to prepare the venison Joseph had given them. Following his instructions, she created a rich broth from the bones and carefully rationed the meat to stretch it as far as possible. The children's faces began to show color again as proper nutrition started to restore their strength, and the baby's cries became stronger and more demanding as his appetite returned. Mary helped her mother with the cooking, chattering excitedly about their visitor and asking when he might return. The child had been transformed by the encounter, her natural optimism restored by the proof that kindness existed in their harsh world. She created stories about Joseph's village and imagined his family gathering around their fire, just as her own family was finally able to do again. Patrick Sullivan returned 3 days later, stumbling through the snow in a drunken stupor, his pockets empty and his promises broken once again. But this time Sarah met his failure with quiet strength rather than despair. The children were fed and warm, proof that survival was possible even without his unreliable provision. The encounter with Joseph had shown her that help could come from unexpected sources, and that her family's welfare didn't have to depend solely on her husband's choices. When Patrick demanded to know where the food had come from, Sarah told him the truth about Joseph's generosity. Her husband's reaction was explosive, filled with racist anger and wounded pride at being helped by someone he considered inferior. But Mary stood up to her father with newfound courage, telling him that Joseph was good and kind, and that being mean about his help was wrong. The child's brave defense of their benefactor marked a turning point in the family dynamics. Mary had learned that goodness could be found in unexpected places and that skin color or cultural differences didn't determine someone's character. Her experience with Joseph had given her a different lens through which to view the world, one that would shape her understanding of justice and compassion for the rest of her life. True to his word, Joseph returned a week later with additional food and warm blankets his wife had woven. He brought dancing waters with him this time, allowing the two girls to meet and begin a friendship that would bridge their communities. Despite Patrick's hostility and threats, Joseph maintained his gentle dignity, focusing on the children's welfare rather than engaging with the angry father. The friendship between the families continued throughout that harsh winter, with Joseph providing not just food but also knowledge about survival in the wilderness. He taught Sarah which plants could be used for medicine, how to preserve meat for long periods, and where to find edible roots and berries when spring arrived. His generosity extended beyond mere charity to genuine education and empowerment. As word of Joseph's kindness spread through both communities, it challenged assumptions on both sides about the nature of their supposed enemies. Some white settlers began to question the stories they had heard about Indian savagery, while some members of Joseph's tribe saw proof that not all white families were greedy land grabbers intent on destroying their way of life. The small wooden cross that Mary had given Joseph became a symbol within his village of the possibility for peace and understanding between different peoples. He would often hold it during tribal council meetings, reminding others that children on both sides deserved protection and care, regardless of the conflicts between their parents' generations. Spring arrived in Northern California with an explosion of wildflowers and the sound of snowmelt rushing down the mountainsides. The Sullivan family had survived the winter, thanks largely to Joseph Running Bear's continued support and the survival skills he had shared with them. Sarah had learned to supplement their diet with wild plants and herbs, knowledge that made them less dependent on Patrick's unreliable income and drinking habits. Mary had grown stronger in more ways than physical during those cold months. Her friendship with Dancing Waters had blossomed despite the language barriers and cultural differences between them. The two girls had developed their own system of communication through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the universal language of childhood play. Their bond had become a living symbol of the possibility for peace between their peoples. Patrick's drinking had not improved, and his resentment toward Joseph's help had festered throughout the winter. He had made several attempts to forbid Sarah from accepting further assistance, but his threats rang hollow when faced with his family's obvious improved health and his own continued failures as a provider. The contrast between his destructive behavior and Joseph's consistent generosity had become impossible to ignore. As the snows melted and travel became easier, tensions in the region began to escalate. Government officials were pressuring all Native American tribes to move to designated reservations, while white settlers demanded military protection from what they saw as Indian threats. The peaceful interactions between the Sullivan and Running Bear families stood in stark contrast to the growing hostility in the wider community. Joseph faced increasing pressure from his own tribal council about his continued contact with white settlers. Some members argued that helping individual families would not prevent the larger injustices being committed against their people, and that his kindness was being wasted on those who would ultimately support policies harmful to the Modoc tribe. But Joseph held firm to his grandfather's teachings about showing mercy to children and helping those in genuine need. One morning in late spring, Mary discovered a small package left outside their cabin door. Inside was a pair of moccasins that Dancing Waters had made for her, decorated with intricate beadwork that told the story of their friendship through symbols and patterns. Along with the shoes was a note written in Joseph's careful English, explaining that his family was being forced to move to a reservation in Oregon and that this would likely be their final gift. The news devastated Mary, who had come to see Joseph and his family as part of her own extended community. She begged her mother to let them say goodbye properly, to give Dancing Waters something in return for the beautiful moccasins. Sarah, understanding the depth of her daughter's attachment and gratitude, agreed to make the dangerous journey to Joseph's village for a final farewell. The meeting between the two families was bittersweet, filled with the pain of forced separation and the knowledge that their friendship had transcended the hatred and fear that divided their communities. Joseph gave Sarah detailed maps showing safe routes through the mountains and the locations of hidden springs and sheltered caves, knowledge that might save her family's life if they ever needed to flee quickly. Mary presented Dancing Waters with her most precious possession, a silver locket that had belonged to her grandmother. Inside, she had placed a small pressed flower from the meadow where they used to play together. The exchange of gifts became a ceremony of sisterhood, witnessed by both families and blessed by Joseph's elderly mother, who spoke of the girl's friendship as a sign of hope for future generations. As Joseph's family prepared to leave for the reservation, he had one final conversation with Sarah about her husband's drinking and the cycle of violence it might bring to her children. He shared stories of his own people's struggles with alcohol and the healing practices that had helped some overcome their addiction. His words planted seeds of understanding that would later help Sarah make difficult decisions about her family's future. Years later, when Mary had grown into a young woman and become a teacher in a frontier school, she would tell her students the story of the Modoc warrior who saved her family. She spoke of kindness crossing cultural boundaries, of the courage required to help strangers, and of the lessons she had learned about judging people by their actions rather than their appearance or background. The wooden cross that Mary had given Joseph was eventually passed down to his grandson, who became a leader in efforts to preserve Modoc culture and build bridges between Native American communities and their neighbors. The small carved symbol served as a reminder that understanding and compassion were possible even in times of great conflict and injustice. Dancing Waters grew up to become a medicine woman who incorporated some of the healing knowledge she had learned from Sarah into her traditional practices. She would often speak of her childhood friendship with the Irish girl as an example of how people from different worlds could learn from each other and find common ground in their shared humanity. The story of that winter became part of the oral history of both communities, told and retold around fires and dinner tables as an example of what was possible when people chose compassion over fear. Mary's whispered words about her father's addiction and Joseph's response of continued generosity became a legend about the power of unconditional kindness to transform even the most desperate situations. In the end, the encounter between a starving child and a generous warrior proved that survival was not just about individual strength or resources, but about the connections formed between people who recognized their shared vulnerability and common need for dignity, respect, and care. Their story became a testament to the truth that in the darkest times, humanity's greatest hope often lies in the simple act of one person choosing to help another, regardless of the boundaries that society might place between them.